the economics of Bitcoin. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's nice to be here. I'm going to talk about Bitcoin, particularly looking at it through an economic lens. Now, there's been a lot of media attention around Bitcoin and blockchain and cryptocurrencies more broadly. I'm going to be focusing on a particular aspect of this space. In particular, when you read about Bitcoin in the press, it's often viewed as kind of a speculative asset, and what's the price, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to be talking about that or those kind of economic aspects at all. I'm going to be viewing Bitcoin through the lens of what it actually does, in that it maintains a distributed ledger and functions as a payment system. Right, so the fundamental idea of the blockchain, as it's applied in Bitcoin and other so-called public, permissionless type of systems, is it's a way to maintain distributed consensus about a kind of ledger, i.e., sort of bank balances, and it's also a way to transfer money from one account to another, i.e., a payment system. So in order to think about Bitcoin as a payment system, I think it's helpful to kind of contrast that with traditional payment systems, systems like PayPal, Venmo, maybe Fedwire or Swift internationally. These are what I'll call centralized payment systems. You have the users at the bottom, and they're all interacting with, let's say, one corporation or one entity that sort of provides the service. Right, that it could be run by a consortium like Swift or Fedwire, could be an individual company. There's network effects here in terms of payment systems. The more people use it, the more useful it is. So oftentimes these are also monopolies. They're natural monopolies, and oftentimes they may need to be regulated. To contrast with that, Bitcoin is a two-sided platform. Again, you have the users on the bottom, people who are maintaining balances and transferring funds between each other. On the other side, you have the service providers. These are the so-called miners. These are the people who are validating those transactions and making sure that, when you spend money, that you actually have it and you haven't spent it before, and so on and so forth. So in some sense, it's a two-sided platform like, Lyft or Uber or Airbnb. But in another sense, it's also different in that there's not an organization or entity modulating the activity in the middle. It's purely done by protocol, by a set of mechanical rules. So, again, we look at centralized monopoly type of solutions. There's a set of rules governing how payments work and so on. That's set by the monopolist. How much infrastructure should be provided to provide reliable service and security and so on. Again, determined by the firm or organization. Typically, the prices are set. PayPal charges a certain fee. If you want to use their service, you pay that. Otherwise, you don't. And ultimately, what's the trust mechanism when I use PayPal to sort of send money? How can I ultimately be sure they're not going to walk away with my money? Well, ultimately, I have legal recourse. Right at the end of the day, I could sue them if they walk off with that money. To contrast with Bitcoin, the rules are intermediated by the protocol in the middle, but all the rest of this is an equilibrium outcome. Right, and that's kind of amazing, right? So it's sort of amazing that it's possible that it functions, and that truly sort of high-value balances are maintained and exchanged in the system. And it's really kind of a novel economic structure that I'm not sure has been seen before, especially this aspect of trust without any sort of rule of law kind of thing. And the purpose of this talk is to sort of try and understand the novel economic structure and understand these equilibrium outcomes that occur here. So just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over related literature. What I'm going to spend the balance of my time talking about, I'm going to take a high-level perspective of just what the blockchain is and how Bitcoin works. I'm going to try and give just enough details in terms of understanding Bitcoin and its implementation of the blockchain from the perspective of a two-sided platform. I'm going to present an economic model which seeks to analyze that, where we have nice analytic solutions and we compare with empirical data, and there's going to be a whole bunch of implications. Mainly, this whole amazing thing that I spoke of. That's it's even incredible that it's kind of possible to build up this trustless system. It's built on. It has some significant downsides, and one of those is that delays are very important. Right? We're going to see that for the well-functioning, from a revenue perspective of Bitcoin, it's important that there be congestion and the attendant delays. And finally, there's going to be some kind of protocol implications. So when thinking about designing these kind of systems, rather than the sort of Bitcoin design where you have infrequent but large blocks, it's going to be much better from an economic perspective to have frequent but small blocks. So time permitting, I'll get into that. So that's the plan. Just sort of to start with a high-level introduction of Bitcoin. The starting point of Bitcoin is a transaction. This is what a Bitcoin transaction looks like. There are some cryptographic addresses in here and so on, but at a high level, there's an input, which is sort of the account that's paying the money. So account X wants to pay 9.5 Bitcoins. It's going to go out 3 Bitcoin to account Y, 16.4 to account Z. So that's 19.4 Bitcoins. The remaining 0.1 Bitcoin is going to be a transaction fee. So we'll kind of come back to that, but putting aside all the systems elements and cryptographic elements and so on, at its core, a Bitcoin is a transaction is a transfer between balances. So what is the blockchain? It is essentially a list of all of these vetted past transactions, organized into blocks, and organized as a linked list back to the beginning of time, or the beginning of Bitcoin, I should say, the so-called Genesis block. And so this is all transactions from the beginning of Bitcoin. And the idea is if I happen to have access to this full blockchain, this is sufficient state to verify account balances. Namely, if Balaji wants to pay me a Bitcoin and I want to check does he own a Bitcoin, I can simply go back to the origin of time and trace the activity in his account and see if there's a Bitcoin that has arrived there that hasn't been spent so far. So this might be an inefficient representation, but nevertheless it's a representation of sufficient state to verify account balances. And the way that Bitcoin works is you have these infrastructure service providers called miners, and each maintains an independent copy of this blockchain. Hence, each miner is able to verify account balances and to verify transactions. So those are all the past transactions. There's a collection of new transactions that people want to affect, but that haven't been incorporated into the blockchain yet. These are sent to all miners, and they hang out in something called a mempool. So these are transactions that haven't been confirmed yet. Every once in a while, 10 minutes on average, a random miner is selected at a miner is selected at random. That miner assembles a bunch of these transactions into a block and adds them to the blockchain. And then that block is transmitted to others. Now, when the others receive that block, they also sort of double check it and make sure that those transactions are valid, that there's no double spending, so on and so forth. So key here, which we'll get back to, is the fact that these appear once every 10 minutes, independent of everything else that's going on, and also that they're limited in size. So each block is limited to be a megabyte, which works out to about 2,000 transactions. So why do the miners bother, right? What's the incentive to participating as an infrastructure provider? Well, you get paid, right? You get paid in 2 ways. If you are elected as the miner that's going to generate the next block, you get a fixed amount of newly minted coins. And also, whatever transaction fees are in the transactions in the block, you get to keep those as well. Right, so there's 2 sources of compensation. Right now, this is probably about 70 to 80% of the compensation. The minting, probably about 20 to 30% is the transaction fees. But these are, so there's a halving schedule that's set to go away over time. The vision is in the long term that the transaction fees will provide the compensation to the infrastructure providers, right? But in any event, there's 2 now. And I talked about sort of a random election. Actually, it's sort of a tournament-based mechanism. This is where you hear about proof of stake and proof of work and so on. I'm not going to sort of get into the details of that. From our perspective, the only thing that's going to be important is that it requires costly effort on the part of the miner to sort of participate in this tournament, and that actually, I said a block comes out on average every 10 minutes. A Poisson approximation with a mean in-arrival time of 10 minutes is that's actually really accurate.
Costly is it with respect to current hardware?
Well, so the tournament that's being played is calibrated looking over the past few weeks, so that the difficulty of that tournament is such that someone can complete it on average every 10 minutes. So it's sort of as hardware gets better, the game that people are playing gets harder. Okay, so why does this all work? Well, the spirit is that if the miners are small, if none of them have a lot of power, the equilibrium for them is to do what they're supposed to do and validate transactions and accept other people's transactions, right? In particular, the event of getting elected as the miner that's going to commit the next block is very rare, and the awards are very large, right? There's enormous rewards. So if, for example, a miner allows transactions that are not valid, right, other miners will sort of detect that and will disregard that block, and the miner will lose the newly minted coins and all the transaction fees and so on. Right? So the idea is, so long as there are a lot of miners and each doesn't have a very much market power, the miner who's selected to produce a block has enormous incentive to have other people accept that block, because that block involves them accumulating some wealth. And so hence, miners will follow the rules. Right? They will only allow valid transactions. They'll verify and accept other people's blocks, so-called follow the longest chain, and so on. So again, under some assumptions that the miners are small. What are some high-level properties here? So the users are picking the transaction fees. Again, this is a little bit different than something like PayPal or Venmo. There, the platform is setting transaction fees. Here, the users decide what to pay. The miners are price takers, because we're assuming that they're each individually small. They can't affect user behavior or block transactions or anything like that. Free entry and exit of miners, right? So you don't need any kind of a special permission and so on. I think the infrastructure level, the number of miners, the amount of effort spent toward mining, that can be viewed as a proxy for security, because of the idea that you have to sort of control a non-trivial percentage of this mining capacity to sort of cheat. So the more miners there are, the more the higher the security of the system is in some sense. And again, getting back to a point I made earlier, the system's throughput doesn't depend on the number of miners. Right? So the difficulty of the tournament is calibrated so that blocks are produced on average every 10 minutes, and the protocol limits the block size to be about 2,000 transactions. Okay, so what's our simplified economic model here? We imagine a whole bunch of small miners with some kind of mining capacity. Blocks are mined at a Poisson process of rate mu. I've already argued that that's a pretty good approximation. Up to k transactions per block. Users also arrive with transactions to process. The arrival rate is going to be less than the aggregate service rate, so that the system is stable. Each user selects a transaction fee, and each user has a different time value of money, i.e. heterogeneous kind of delay cost. Right, so we're going to try and understand how this platform works from the perspective of both the miners and the users. So we're going to make some assumptions here. I'm not going to go into them in too much in the detail of time. I'm going to assume that nobody balks, that everybody goes through the service. This can be relaxed. I'm going to assume that no coins are minted. Again, the long-term vision is that transaction costs are the only compensation, but in any event, it wouldn't be so difficult to add minting to our model, so that's sort of without loss of generality. And I'm also going to assume that, again, there's so many miners that no individual miner has market power. Is there a question?
Yeah, is in the current system, is it actually the case that fees are chosen?
Yes. Yes. Okay, so from the miners' perspective of the miners, things are actually pretty easy. So in equilibrium, an active miner, well, if they're elected to produce the next block, what are they going to do? They're going to process the K transactions with the highest transaction fees. Right? So if there's a whole bunch of transactions waiting to be processed, let's say more than K, they have incentive to pick the K with the highest transaction fees because they obviously want to maximize their wealth. And we're assuming, again, that the individual miners are small, so they can't do things like threaten, not to process transactions unless there's a minimal fee or, so on and so forth, right? So that's the behavior of the miners. The total payments of the miners is going to be equal to the total transaction fees. And since there's free entry and exit, there should basically be a zero profit condition, i.e. If there are n miners and the revenue is the amount of transaction cost revenue, my chances of being elected is a fraction 1 over n. So the number of miners should be such that this is equal to the cost of an individual mining, and that's given by that condition. Yes?
Just about the no one works, so that's the blocks don't work. Not the miners. The miners can enter or exit.
The miners can enter and exit, but what I'm assuming is if you show up to make a payment, and let's say it's going to be very expensive to make that payment, you don't say, OK, I'm not going to use the system.
So you as a block, as someone...
You as someone who wants to make a transaction. And again, that can be relaxed. It just makes some of the formulas more complicated. OK, so and this is what a mine actually looks like if you're curious. All right, so the user side is actually much more interesting. What we can already kind of see from the fact that the miners are incentive to work with the highest transaction fee transactions is that basically this is going to be a congestion queuing game where the transaction fees are basically bids for priority. Right? And so blocks are mined and added, independent of the number of miners. We're going to look for an equilibrium where, let's say, a user with type CI, again, that's the delay cost, will choose the bid to maximize their utility, which is given here. And so this is the value of the service, which is assuming is pretty high. This is how much they're paying. And this is their waiting cost, which depends on what other people bid. And again, analogous to earlier work that's being done with these kind of priority queues, you can basically work out that the amount of time you wait is basically the fraction of people who are higher type than you in the sense that they're more sensitive for time. Right? So this is sort of relatively standard. Then you can, you get explicit expressions for the waiting times and so on. This is a little bit more complicated than what you might be used to, let's say, for something like an MM1 queue, and that's because you have this batch service of block size k. But nevertheless, you can sort of figure out everything analytically. And in equilibrium, you get an outcome as such. Users with higher delay costs pay higher transaction fees. And the transaction fee paid by the user, which is given by this expression, this is actually equal to the externality that they're imposing on other lower priority users in terms of increasing their delay. Right? So this is actually a VCG mechanism. People are paying the delay cost externality that they incur on others. Right, so I'll just pause for a second here and highlight maybe some differences to a monopoly setting. In a monopoly setting, transactions are excluded. A minimal fee is set, and if you're not willing to pay that fee, those users are excluded and surplus is lost. Here, you generate revenue without excluding anybody, but the flip side is in order to convince people to pay, you have to threaten them with congestion. Right? So we'd like to see how that works overall. We can come up with relatively close form expressions for the delay costs incurred in an equilibrium and the revenue. It depends on the distribution of the types, of a level of overall congestion in terms of sort of the system load, and the block size. The formulas are there. But the amazing thing is actually it really matches the data well. Right, so here on the transaction fee side, we can observe what that is historically. Here I have a data set which is about 6 years of data for Bitcoin. Each point is a day. On the x-axis is the average block size for that day. And remember that the maximum block size is a megabyte. So the average block size on a day, that's a proxy for the system load for how congested it is. It's going to be, as a fraction of the megabyte, a number between 0 and 1. On the y-axis is the total transaction fee revenue for block. And you can see that the black curve is a model calibrated with one parameter, and the dots are the actual data, I'll make a couple of observations. The first is, unless you have reasonably high load, like 70, 80%, there's basically no revenue generated by this mechanism. You need significant delay to start to generate revenue. Once you do get to the 70 or 80%, you do start to generate revenue, and in fact it can be significant, but it also becomes wildly unstable. Right? Small variations in the arrival rate of customers result in big shifts in the amount of revenue that's generated. Right, so users will pay transaction fees for faster service, but this is only relevant if the system is congested and there are actually delays. I'm not sure I'll have time to get into this, but this will be exacerbated by a large block size, and our model kind of quantifies this and illustrates that actually you need significant utilization before any kinds of fees are generated. And the contrapositive of that is important also. If there aren't significant delays, there will be no revenues. Right? So this illustrates a potential sort of pitfall for the system. There's kind of two outcomes, right? The system could be popular and congested, in which case there will be a lot of transaction fees, a lot of miners. There will be a good amount of security, maybe even too much. Right? Who knows if the right amount is being spent on security. On the other hand, if people start to view the system as maybe too congested, maybe they sort of stop using it, the congestion level goes down, miners are paid less, miners start quitting, the system starts becoming less secure, and people start leaving and the system collapses. Right? And so there's important implications when people talk about scaling. Maybe the number one issue within the technical communities around Bitcoin is how to make it process more transactions per second, because it's perceived to be slow and congested. For example, here's something from January. There's a conference of Bitcoin enthusiasts in Miami, and they stopped accepting Bitcoin as a payment. Right? Why? Because it's too expensive and there's too much congestion. And I would argue that that's not a bug, that's a feature. Right? The alternative is if you don't have any congestion, there will be no transaction fee payments, and the system won't be self-sustaining in the long term. Yes?
The conclusion I'm a little it feels like one of these platforms where, as you say, it's two-sided, and the miners are needed for those who want to make transactions. And it's self-regulating, meaning if there aren't enough transactions, then there don't need to be enough miners. Not much to verify. I'm not talking about the fact that more miners ensures security.
But you're saying, so the number of transactions is not proxy for how much value is in the system, right? So you could have a system where there's a lot of value being stored in these ledgers, but with few transactions, right? And then someone could come in with a small number of miners and take over it and sort of steal people's money.
But this is ignoring the Coinbase issue, right? You get paid just for the mere fact of mining a block.
No, I'm including that.
But then there is always an incentive to mine, because you get paid for mining, whether you're
So,
processing a lot of transactions or not.
right, so you get paid for mining via two mechanisms, right?
Yeah, I understand that.
So you're saying it's ignoring minting. So good. So I'm taking the long-term view of ignoring the minted transactions. For Bitcoin, for Ethereum, that's what those developers say, is that we want sort of a finite supply of coins. In the long run, there will only be transaction fees. There might be an alternative model where you always mint. Right, and maybe this sort of argues for that, but that has different implications in the fact of sort of being inflationary.
But it would change the conclusions a bit.
If you always mint, it would change the conclusions. All right. Just to sort of wrap up, I'll make one sort of final observation in terms of the system parameters. There are, if you think about what's generating the congestion here, what's generating the load, there are the arrivals, which those are customers, you don't control that. On the other hand, there's how frequently blocks are generated, the block rate, and the block size, and these are two things that are in the control of at least the protocol designer, right? So a natural kind of question is, how should these be decided? And I'm not going to go into the details, but there is a asymptotic limit where we take k very large, where basically your revenue and your delay costs scale separately at a fixed level of load with the number of with the size of the block. And the implication of that is as follows: each of these curves, on the x-axis I have the revenue, on the y-axis I have the delay cost, and I'm looking at kind of an efficient frontier of, with a particular block size, as I vary the block rate, how much revenue would I generate? And the large block asymptotics say that these are all kind of scaled versions of each other. Right, that was the corollary that I quickly went through. And so you can see kind of here, if my goal is to, let's say, generate $2,000 a block, if I want to do that with a block size of 20, well, there's going to be a certain delay cost here. If I want to do that with a block size of 200, it's going to be 100 times more in terms of the delays I need to impose on people in order to generate the same amount of revenue. And that kind of makes sense, because if you think of situations where you have sort of very large blocks, the incentives that are generated are to compete to be the kth person. Right? So if K is very large, you might have someone who has enormous time value of money, but is not going to bid very much because they only need to be in the 2,000th or 20,000th position, and hence they have to face an enormous amount of delay before they start ponying up. So our conclusion here is that people should consider much smaller block sizes. More broadly, I think this kind of idea of a blockchain, it's kind of amazing that it's possible, but a major downside of at least the current sort of implementation in terms of Bitcoin and Ethereum or so on, is that the transaction fees really rely on congestion, and not even just a little of congestion, but you really need a lot of congestion in order to generate revenue, and this will generate kind of delay costs. So I think, at least from an academic perspective, a really kind of interesting question is to sort of think about what other revenue generating rules might there be, because it feels like here, while you don't have sort of the monopolist extracting rent, you have to impose these sort of artificial delays, and there's an attendant social cost to that. Thanks.
Setting up this time for one question. Great.
Does this also suggest that you could somehow fragment the people who are mining into different pools and then aggregate them later? Like you could artificially, you could have smaller congestion by causing smaller mining pools and then somehow combine it. So if there was a way of decentrally combining multiple of these blockchains together.
Right, so there's, people have proposals for kind of sharding, right, in terms of not so much segregating the miners, but, segregating the users, right, segregating the bank accounts, if you will, and then a miner could choose to mine on different blocks and you could sort of combine them. So there are proposals for that. I personally am not familiar with the details. I think the challenges would be if you're on one shard and I'm on a different shard, how do I pay you, right? We have to sort of synchronize those two things.
I suggest that if you could do that, you would get like the best of both. Like you could sustain.
Possibly. I think a bigger picture thing is the security in the system is coming from many, many people sort of checking the same transaction, and at some level that's also enormously wasteful, right? So if we could somehow make it so that you shard things, and then a small number of people check each sort of shard, and then those are somehow combined, maybe there will also be like big efficiency gains that way. Yes?
To what extent does your conclusion rely on assuming that people are not interested in sustaining the system because there's a hundreds of $billion market cap in the system? So like people who currently own Bitcoin would lose a lot of money if the system crashed.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So you might think of, especially from the perspective of the miners, right? So I'm assuming the miners mine because it's profitable, right? Maybe they'll mine even though it's not profitable, but simply because they have huge Bitcoin balances, and so that would be outside the model, but that's a good point.
We'll have time for conversation later on. So next speaker is Professor Dan Bonet. He's going to talk about